Hi everyone, my name is Nick Wignall. I'm a clinical psychologist and the founder of The Friendly Mind, a free weekly newsletter where I share practical, evidence-based advice for emotional health and well-being. In today's video, we're going to be talking about chronic irritability. Now, all of us get irritable from time to time. Of course, it's a very human, normal thing. But some people struggle with chronic irritability, which means they have persistent and frequent bouts of irritability, much more than is typical for most people. Of course, all sorts of things can contribute to chronic irritability like this, and many of them are not things we have a whole lot of control over. So it could be things like everything from your genetics and temperament, or something that happened to you or didn't happen to you in your childhood, right? We don't have a lot of control over our genetics or our past. It could be side effects from a medication or hormonal shifts. Maybe you're going through puberty or menopause or something like that. It could be structural inequalities or systematic forms of oppression, definitely can contribute to chronic irritability. Even things like physical illness, chronic pain, certainly. So there's a ton of things that can contribute to chronic irritability, but a lot of these we don't have a ton of direct control over, as important as they are. On the other hand, there are a handful of psychological causes of chronic irritability that all have the benefit of being things just about anyone can directly control, can exert a lot of control over, and as a result, experience a lot less chronic irritability. So I'm going to walk through three of the most common psychological causes of chronic irritability and offer some really brief practical ideas for how you can start to improve them. Number one, unaddressed resentment. Resentment is a form of anger that's characterized by rumination and an unwillingness to confront the problem in a straightforward manner. So, a simple example to illustrate: a husband resents his wife because she is not as physically affectionate as he would like her to be. He frequently thinks about this, ruminates on it, stews on it, dwells on it, about why she is the way she is, how he wishes she were different, how his friends, both his two best friends maybe, both have wives who are very physically affectionate, and comparing their wives to his wife, that sort of thing. Lots of rumination. The thing is, he's unwilling to have a direct conversation with his wife about this issue because it feels too awkward and uncomfortable. Instead, he frequently resorts to kind of passive aggressive comments about her lack of physical affection, where he never comes out and says what the problem is or what he would like to be differently, but he sort of throws little jabs or barbs out there. Then over time, this chronic resentment, it leads to a significant lack or deficit of trust and intimacy in the relationship, which has the really terrible side effect, among other things, of exacerbating the very problem that he resents. Now, even if you don't struggle with this particular issue, the general formula should probably be pretty familiar, which is people who are chronically irritable, they almost always have some form of unaddressed resentment in their life. And very often, the resentment revolves around other people, specifically people who are close to that person. So it's things like spouses or partners, it could be bosses or managers at work, it could be parents, it could even be kids. And because these people are a constant presence in their life, they're constantly being triggered into these kind of spirals of resentment. Then, because they have this habit of ruminating unhelpfully, anytime this initial resentment gets triggered, it's very likely to kind of morph into full blown bad moods or bouts of irritability. And then finally, because they're unwilling to actually address the issue in a straightforward way, their relationships just continue to kind of deteriorate, and therefore irritability just becomes more and more common and more intense frequently. Now, 90% of the time, the solution to this unaddressed resentment involves simply becoming more assertive. There's a lot of myths and misconceptions about what that means, being more assertive. But basically, it just means communicating your authentic wants and needs in a way that is honest, but also respectful of other people. So it might be being willing to broach a difficult or awkward conversation with somebody. It could be telling someone else honestly but respectfully what they're doing that's bothering you. It might be asking for something that you want in a really simple, non defensive way, even if it's uncomfortable. Or it might be firmly but respectfully saying no and setting a boundary. Now, all that said, I want to take a real quick moment to acknowledge that occasionally people hold on to resentments with people who are no longer present, often people who have died and passed away, So it could be a deceased parent, it could be a boss you no longer work for, things of that nature. And in this case, really the only thing you have left, because you can't be assertive with that person, presumably, it really then comes down to breaking this habit of rumination. Yes, there will always be memories and things that trigger those resentments from people who are no longer with us, but you don't have to keep dwelling on them. Rumination, however strong, it is a habit and it can be broken. So, how do we get started? If you suspect that you have unaddressed resentments going on in your life and that is impacting this tendency towards chronic irritability, I think the really good first step is to basically do two things. A, identify the people in your life whom you are feeling resentful towards. And then B, figure out what the specific issue is. Get clarity on the specific issue that you resent them for. So, what I would do, take 20 or 30 minutes, go someplace nice, quiet, get out a pen and paper, and just spend some time writing about your resentment. When do I tend to feel resentful? What are the situations or triggers there? Whom do I feel resentful towards? Who are the people that kind of come to mind immediately when I think about resentment or irritability? Now, doing this is really important because A, you might just like learn some new things about yourself. It's amazing what happens when you put pen to paper. But it really importantly, writing about things specifically is key because all these things they're in our heads, but they're kind of fuzzy. When you write, you force yourself to get clarity about issues that are inherently a little bit nebulous or murky or fuzzy, right? So forcing yourself to write things down leads to a lot of clarity. And that clarity is really critical if you're going to take the next necessary step to actually start addressing those resentments by being more assertive. If you've done the work to clarify what exactly you're resentful about, whom you're resentful towards, and what you think needs to change, that clarity is going to make it a lot easier actually to start being assertive, to bring up those difficult conversations, to say what you really need to say. Number two, chronic anxiety. Now, it might seem superficially like irritability and anxiety are completely different emotions, but it's actually very common for them to show up together because chronic anxiety is one of the biggest contributors to chronic irritability. So they often pair up. For example, I had a client I once worked with. We'll call her Sophie. Sophie came to see me because she was having trouble at work. She was an excellent worker, generally really good at her job, but she had gotten a lot of feedback recently, including some from coworkers, but even from her manager, whom she really enjoyed and appreciated and respected. But they were all saying basically the same thing, which is that she was getting very irritable, short, snappy with people, especially during particularly stressful times. Of course, this isn't surprising or uncommon. Most people probably get irritable when we're stressed out to some degree. But what really bothered Sophie was that she wasn't very aware of it in the moment. I remember her saying something to the effect of, I like to think of myself as a pretty self-aware, insightful person, but this irritability thing, I can see it after people tell me. I can look back and go, oh yeah, I could see why that would be. People would think I was pretty irritable, and actually, I think I was irritable, but I didn't recognize it in the moment. And that, understandably, really bothered Sophie. So, after working together, what I eventually helped Sophie to see is that this irritability, it was actually being caused by some underlying chronic anxiety that she wasn't very aware of. See, this is a really common pattern for kind of high achieving types like Sophie, which is they spend so much of their life, and I include myself in this category, we're really good at following the rules, filling out the worksheets perfectly, getting great grades, acing the performances, all that kind of stuff. But as a result of that, because we're so good at that, right? Or pretty good anyway. We lose touch with how we're feeling emotionally because we're good at putting aside how we happen to feel in the moment, so we can stay focused on the goal or the grade or what other people want of us. We chronically start to lose touch with how we're feeling. And if you're a high achiever, you're going to tend to put yourself in situations where you are under a lot of stress and experience a lot of anxiety. But if you have this built-in vulnerability where you don't realize it when you're anxious, or it takes a long time for you to realize when it's anxious, that anxiety may be contributing to effects like chronic irritability, and you don't see it, you miss it, because you have this habit of ignoring those emotions, including anxiety. So if you struggle with chronic irritability and also tend to run a little anxious, you're a little high strung, you're kind of have a lot of stress, burnout maybe, the solution may actually be to spend less time trying to address the irritability directly and instead address the underlying anxiety that's contributing to it. Okay, so how do we get started with this? Well, there are many forms of anxiety and almost an infinite number of origins of where anxiety comes from for different people, given their different histories and temperaments and lives and all that sort of thing. But there's only one direct cause of anxiety, and that is worry, which means you can significantly reduce your overall chronic anxiety by getting better at identifying and letting go of your habit of chronic worry. I actually teach a whole course on this called Creating Calm. It's all about undoing the habits of chronic worry and anxiety. And in that course, I teach a really simple but amazingly powerful exercise called scheduled worry. It's like my favorite exercise. It's the one that works the best for the vast majority of people in terms of how do I relatively quickly and immediately lower chronic anxiety and worry. And what you do, it's a little counterintuitive. Most people are like, I don't know, doesn't sound like a good idea. But basically, what you do is you carve out some time every single day to deliberately confront and write down all the things you're worried about. Now, the reason this works, even though it seems so strange, like I'm anxious and worried, why would I want to think more about my worries? What it does is by rewarding your brain for worrying at a set time every day, it actually makes it less likely that your brain will throw worries at you kind of erratically throughout the whole day. There's a lot more to it, but if you're interested in that technique, you can go to, I'll put a link in the description, but scheduledworry.com. I've put together a little page that explains what the technique is and how to get started doing it. So you can check that out. But that's a great first step for reducing chronic anxiety. So tackle your chronic worry, which will reduce the chronic anxiety, which will then have a beneficial effect on that chronic irritability. Number three, emotional moralizing. Emotional moralizing means that you're in the habit of judging your emotions as good or bad, and often yourself as good or bad for having those emotions. For example, let's say you turn in a big project at work and you immediately get some negative feedback and you unsurprisingly start to feel a little bit anxious. But then the first thought that goes through your mind after you're feeling anxious is feeling anxious about this is silly, grow up. Right? So you're judging the anxiety. Consequently, you start to feel ashamed and maybe a little angry at yourself for feeling anxious. And this leads to more anxiety and irritability. Or maybe you haven't heard back from your girlfriend about the dinner plans you suggested via text earlier in the day, and you're feeling a little annoyed with her. But then you say to yourself, don't be such a jerk. She's probably just busy. Judging yourself for feeling annoyed is only likely to make you feel ashamed, anxious, angry about feeling annoyed, which just increases your odds of more irritability going forward. Now, both of these situations I just described are examples of a more general phenomenon called compound emotions. A compound emotion is when you take an initial emotion, you judge it as bad, and it leads to another emotion. And combined, these two emotions are much more intense and longer lasting than the initial one would have been on its own. So it usually takes the form of things like anger about sadness. You're feeling sad, but then you get angry at yourself for feeling sad. Or guilt about feeling anxious. You're feeling anxious, but then you think it's bad somehow, and so you feel guilty about feeling anxiety. Anxiety about regret. You're regretting something in the past, but then you're feeling anxious about, oh no, is my regret going to turn into depression? Something like that. Now, consider this though. We all experience uncomfortable, difficult emotions all the time, from minor bouts of nervousness and fear to sadness, annoyance, anger, disappointments, all sorts of stuff like that. Totally normal, if a little uncomfortable. But if you're feeling these things all the time, which all of us do, feel these minor difficult emotions all the time, if you're in the habit every time that happens of judging yourself for feeling that way, you're compounding all of those emotions and making them significantly bigger than they otherwise would be. And for a lot of people, this emotional moralizing or judgment, it leads to chronic anxiety. That's one very common effect. For some people, it leads to depression. But for other people, it actually leads to chronic irritability. So, this moralizing about your emotions, treating your emotions as good or bad, leads to compounding emotions, which exacerbates chronic irritability. That's the basic progression. But the thing to understand is, however unpleasant or difficult or even painful an emotion is, it can't be bad or good. for the simple reason that we don't have direct control over our emotions. And something that you don't have control over can't be morally good or bad. The rain is not good or bad. You might like that it's raining one day and not like that it's raining another day, but that doesn't make rain good or bad. Rain is neither good nor bad, it's just rain. Or having brown hair. You might like brown hair, you might not like brown hair. Brown hair is not good or bad, right? Because it's not a thing you have control over. Remember, just because an emotion feels bad doesn't mean it is bad or that you're bad for feeling it. And if you struggle with chronic irritability, it's very possible that the core issue is this deep belief that to feel bad emotionally is bad and that you are bad on some level if you're feeling bad emotionally. But to change a belief like this takes action, not just words. So you can tell yourself till you're blue in the face that it's okay to feel whatever you're feeling. And that's fine. Like, that's a good thing to do to validate those emotions. But if you're doing that, but then also if your actions contradict that, if you're continuing to avoid or try to get rid of difficult emotions, nothing's going to change. Your brain is going to continue to believe that those things are bad and it's not okay to feel bad. Because understandably, no matter what you're saying, your brain just sees you constantly running away from or fighting with your emotions and trying to get rid of them. So it's not surprising that it continues to think of them as bad. And this belief that it's bad to feel bad persists. So, in addition to reminding yourself that it's okay to feel whatever you're feeling, even if you don't like them, you need to get in the habit of accepting and tolerating difficult emotions rather than trying to avoid or fix and get rid of them. So, how do we get started with this? The ability to tolerate difficult emotions is a core skill in emotional resilience. And the best way to get started building that ability, increasing your capacity to tolerate rather than run away from or avoid difficult emotions, is to do what we do with any kind of skill in life, but somehow we sort of forget that this is the process when it comes to our own kind of internal and emotional development. I call this incrementalism. Incrementalism basically just means start small and work your way up slowly. So instead of you feel terribly anxious out of the blue and you think, oh my God, I got to tolerate all this anxiety. Well, sure, ideally, it would be nice if you could tolerate huge bouts of anxiety. But is it really realistic to expect that you will be able to do that if you have never practiced emotional tolerance? No, of course not. Right? That's like thinking, I want to play the piano. Let me pull some Mozart and start playing that. No, that's just not going to happen. It's not realistic. You got to start with Twinkle Twinkle Little Star and then work your way up slowly and progressively until you build up both the skill, the competence, as well as the confidence, the inner belief that you can do it. So the same is true of tolerating difficult emotions. And what this means is you want to look for opportunities to practice tolerating very small emotions. The kind of emotion that is so small and insignificant, you probably just wouldn't give it a second thought when it happens to you. But what you want to do, if you want to increase the skill of emotional tolerance, you want to reframe those as practice opportunities. So if you start to get really good at tolerating minor emotions, you feel a little bit anxious, and instead of just blowing it off, you say, okay, I don't like feeling anxious, but you know what? I'm willing to feel anxious and continue on with sending this difficult text I need to send or giving this talk that I'm feeling a little nervous about. If you practice that in small ways, you'll be more confident and competent to do it in medium-sized ways with medium-sized difficult emotions. And as you continue to practice, you will eventually then be able to tolerate rather than avoid those big, overwhelming emotions. And the better you get, again, at tolerating rather than avoiding emotions, the less they compound and the less likely they are to turn into chronic irritability. All you need to know, while there are many, many factors that contribute to chronic irritability, there are three psychological causes of chronic irritability that have the benefit of being things that we can directly control, we can do something about. Those are unaddressed resentments, chronic anxiety, and emotional moralizing. Get better at dealing with those, and you'll find that your chronic irritability decreases dramatically. All right, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more from me about irritability, anxiety, emotional resilience, things like that, I write a free weekly newsletter called The Friendly Mind, where I share my newest articles, tips, tools, ideas, videos, and everything else. It goes out every Monday morning. It's totally free, and I would love to have you join our little community.